I'm glad to be able to join you on this Interdependence Day, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. There were many mistakes made in responding to those terrible attacks. The worst, in my view, was to start a war on terrorism. I pleaded at the time that we should treat these terrible, atrocious acts as crimes against humanity and focus on the criminality and going after the criminals. But those mistakes were made and we paid a high price, because when you declare a war, it's easier to erode standards, particularly standards of international human rights. And the United States fell below those standards, and it had a terrible knock-on effect elsewhere in the world, as I saw firsthand. But I also welcomed the fact that very soon afterwards, civil society groups and many, many people in the United States and around the world said we have to react to this. We have to come back to our standards. We have to understand and be more interconnected. Hence Interdependent Day each year, and the movement to support. I take great heart at the moment from what has happened in the Middle East, the Arab Spring. What was it that social media helped people to be brave enough to come out into the street? They knew that they wouldn't be alone. There'd be 10, 100, and afterwards thousands. What did they want? They wanted dignity, human rights, democracy, participation, the end of dictatorship, the end of corruption. And they were not Western values. They were universal values. Another great moment of hope was what happened in Norway following a terrible internal act of terrorism, if you like, the killing of all those young people and the bombing in Oslo itself. The incredible spirit of we are going to respond by putting even more emphasis on our values, from Prime Minister Stoltenberg to those young people themselves who had been gathering together because they were political activists. And they are reaffirmed and confirmed in their values and in the importance of those standards. We can learn a great deal from Norway. I think it's very important in the 21st century that we understand the value of broad alliances. It's the only way we will really make a difference. And in my view, the broader the better. If we can have the UN, governments, regional organizations such as the European Union, the African Union, and so on, but also civil society and increasingly the private sector. These are alliances now in all kinds of ways. I'm dealing in climate. There's a clean cook stove alliance to get clean cooking to the 2.7 billion people, mainly women, who still use firewood or animal dung and ingest fumes that are bad for them and often for their children who are around when the cooking is taking place. There are other broad alliances. The elders that I now belong to have a global alliance under the title Girls Not Brides, about tackling child marriage, and we are looking to the broadest possible grouping. The idea of being more interdependent, of understanding and valuing different cultures, and of understanding and valuing diversity, I think is extraordinarily important.
Take us back to where you were on September 11th in 2001 and what you remember thinking might be coming next.
On September the 11th, 2001, I was back in Ireland having completed the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, and I was in a beautiful part of the west of Ireland, and I heard about the terrible attacks and rushed to a television set in a local fisherman's home and watched on a small black and white television the terrible scenes of aeroplanes full of people, full of gasoline, hitting buildings to kill as many people as possible. And I knew that this would be very devastating, not just for the families, and we must remember them a decade later and sympathise with their decade of grief, but also the way in which it would undermine, or could undermine, international human rights standards. And unfortunately it did, because of the approach of declaring, instantly almost, a war on terrorism. The response was, we have been attacked, we are at war. Instead of, these are crimes against humanity. We must use all the resources, and in fact international human rights law requires every country to work together to bring perpetrators of crimes against humanity to justice. If we'd kept that route as much as possible, I think we could have avoided a lot of the problems.
Do you think we can, or are we coming any closer to finding strategies for eliminating terrorism, the war on terrorism, both?
I think it's important to look at each particular context and try to be very specific about what we want to achieve. In July this year, I was in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa because of the terrible crisis there, a drought, and while I was in Somalia, parts of it were declared to be famine. In the 21st century, the fact that we would have a famine declared. But one of the reasons why Somalia has not made progress is that there is a group there called Al-Shabaab who have connections with Al-Qaeda, that's true, but they have been kind of branded with this T-word terrorism. So it has made the whole of Somalia a no-go area. And that's part of the reason why thousands of children, beautiful, lovely Somali children, are dying by the day. When I was there, they said about 28,000 had already died, and it's a great deal more now, and the rains won't come until at least October. And that terrorism word is too broad and crude. Many governments started calling their opposition political terrorists or terrorists. We saw it in so many different contexts, and I believe we have to be as specific as possible and as narrow and focused on dealing with terrible criminality, which terrorism is. Human rights people are not soft on terrorism, not at all. I want the perpetrators of terrorism to be brought to justice as a matter of human rights.
A lot of people in the United States feel a little overwhelmed by the problems they have at home. What's your message to those who sometimes feel like withdrawing from the world?
I think it's important during this Interdependence Day to reflect on the importance of the United States staying engaged in the world, not sort of retreating because of economic difficulties into a more isolated position, but to staying engaged in a new way, in a very interdependent way, in a multipolar way. It's not necessary or appropriate in the 21st century for the United States to somehow say we have to have a special role. Yes, the United States is, and I think will remain for a very considerable time, certainly the most powerful in a military sense and to a very considerable extent in an economic sense, despite the rise and size of China. But it's much more important that America leads by being a good partner, by being a good lead partner in any broad alliance. And I think this is also what American civil society can do. You have incredible groups, you have incredible universities, you have incredible foundations, all of whom are already playing a part in the world. Your engagement is vital because we have complex problems and we can't solve them on our own. We have to solve them together. So I commend the whole movement for interdependence, the fact that you've been marking the years up to this 10th year, and in particular I hope you have a really good and thoughtful meeting this year.